We've never seen anything like this. It's the #1 killer in the U.S. for those under 50. Many were minor children. More dead each year than 3 wars that spanned 5 decades. It's everywhere. Stopping the crisis will require unity and leadership.
There is some very big news that we're going to talk about with 2 arrests. I'm very pleased again to have Vanda Felbab-Brown with us to discuss the issue of fentanyl, but today, far more specifically, a significant event. And so welcome, Vanda. Good to see you.
Thank you very much, Paul. Quite a dramatic time to be on the show.
Yes. And I just reached out to you as I'm watching you tweet and watching you all over this issue, because I know this is what you do. And I thought, let's go live and let's talk about this so we can really get to some of the details. So Vanda, maybe before we get to the bust and the arrest, do you want to just talk a little bit about the backdrop of the Sinaloa Cartel, what they do? We might have some watchers or listeners that aren't as familiar about their influence, and then we'll get to the significance of this.
Sure, that sounds very good. But just to set the context, if anyone hasn't caught the news, yesterday evening it was announced that 2 very top levels of the Sinaloa Cartel were arrested. One of them is the leader of one branch. His nickname is El Mayo. And the other is one of the so-called Chapitos, who are the sons of El Chapo Guzman, the very famous, notorious drug trafficker, one of the most notorious drug traffickers ever in history, and one of the most powerful men in Mexico. Well, El Mayo is much less known, but arguably he is an even more important figure, or certainly his arrest is really enormously consequential. So with that, Paul, let me go to your question. What is the Sinaloa Cartel? So the Sinaloa Cartel is the top drug trafficking organization in Mexico and one of the most important drug trafficking and organized crime group anywhere around the world. In Mexico, they have been around since the late 1980s. And today they dominate much of drug trafficking, as well as many other legal and illegal economies in Mexico, from extortion to illegal fishing, but very importantly, legal fishing, mining, legal and illegal extraction of timber. And they also have enormous political infiltration into all levels of the Mexican government. They don't have a monopoly in the market. They share this dominant position with the arch rival group that is known as Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación. Now, they're not just focused on Mexico. They are the principal actors organizing drug trafficking across the Americas. Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación and Sinaloa are the principal producers of fentanyl that comes to the United States. They also bring methamphetamine, which they cook in Mexico, as well as cocaine, but they are deeply involved and organize or help organize criminal markets across the Americas. And they also have significant presence in other parts of the world. And here is where the Sinaloa Cartel especially was really a pioneer in building up drug markets in Europe, in Africa, in the Asia-Pacific region, as well as increasingly in the Middle East.
And with that, I know that in the around 2013, 2014, with respect to fentanyl specifically, these guys, or this family, this Los Chapitos, the sons of, weren't very secret about their intentions about fentanyl being on the streets of America.
Well, I don't know whether secret is the right word. What we know that was going on in their calculation is the result of really the amazing capacities of U.S. law enforcement, its wiretap and signal intelligence capacities, as well as the extraordinarily repeated infiltration that U.S. law enforcement was able to do into the Sinaloa Cartel, to have repeated hits against it, starting with the final arrest of the father, El Chapo, and his extradition to the United States, where he is spending a life in imprisonment in the Supermax facility in Colorado. And subsequently after that, various hits against other actors, including one of the sons of El Chapo, who is one of the Chapitos, the 4 sons who have been co-leading one branch of the Sinaloa Cartel, Ovidio Guzman in March, and now the other son, Joaquin Guzman Lopez. They were secretive about getting into fentanyl. They also were keenly instrumental and made it happen. What I think was striking about the Chapitos was both the decision to go into fentanyl and then the way they went about fentanyl. So fentanyl started hitting the US market around 2012, 2013. And at the time, it was produced in China in a finished form of fentanyl and shipped from China, oftentimes directly by postal services or other courier services, to the United States. And the Chapitos were watching the US drug market to start shifting toward the super potent drug that had tremendous advantages for drug traffickers, even as it posed tremendous risks for users. The big advantages for drug traffickers were that its production is very cheap. The chemicals from which it's made in China are easy to obtain. And it's so potent that very small amounts of both the precursor chemicals and the finished product are sufficient to supply the entire market. So if you kind of think of the total amount of heroin or cocaine it takes to supply the US market for a year, it would take 1/10 or even less than 1/10 of that amount of fentanyl. So for traffickers, this is a perfect commodity to operate, because very little of it needs to be hidden, very little of it needs to evade law enforcement attention. And it's very cheap to make. Now, from the user's perspective, this was a horrendous drug because its potency is such that overdose becomes very, very easy. Hence the dramatic rise in deaths in the United States. Tens of thousands of people. We are currently at the level of 110,000 Americans dying a year from drug death overdose. Not all of those are fentanyl caused or fentanyl only, but the majority of them are caused by fentanyl. So the Chapitos are watching the Chinese criminal networks bringing this super potent drug in, and then made a choice as to whether to get on the bandwagon or try to suppress it. And even before they moved into fentanyl, their arch rival, Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, moved. They jumped in first. Now, when that happened, the Chapitos felt they could not stay behind. They had to compete with Jalisco.
Jalisco jumped in first?
Most likely. I mean, it's, we're all operating on very sporadic, very limited information, but it appeared that Jalisco was actually the first mover, that they first started experimenting also with production of fentanyl in Mexico, even before the Chapitos caught onto it. But when that happened, the Chapitos decided to go 100% in, and did so in a way that would be completely indifferent to what kind of deaths they cause in the US. So these extraordinary wiretaps, really major credit to US law enforcement capacities, have the Chapitos talking among each other about, well, is it too risky that we go into fentanyl? We can, that there is this tremendous problem that we will be killing a lot of users, one of them says. And then another one says, oh, it doesn't matter. We'll just get so many more people addicted. We'll create streets of American junkies so we can absorb having scores of people die. And at various times, you have them sending fentanyl batches that are too potent, that are faulty. They know they will kill people, that the level of dosage is too high, and they still do it, even though it would be so cheap for them to just stop that batch. It's very easy for them to move to another batch. Now, the other guy who was arrested, and I'll hand it over to you, El Mayo Zambada, is not one of the Chapitos. He is the buddy co-founder of the Sinaloa Cartel with their father. He is one of the old guards. He is the consigliere of the drug market in Mexico. And ultimately today, the Zambada branch is in fentanyl also. But it took much longer for that branch to get into it. And Zambada El Mayo was all along very unhappy with the way the Chapitos were brash, aggressive, and disregarding many of the old red lines that he, El Chapo, were operating, and the indifference with which they were drawing the wrath of U.S. law enforcement and U.S. government onto the home base, the headquarters of the Sinaloa Cartel, Sinaloa itself, and places around Culiacan.
So to be clear then, they weren't secret. It was the amazing work of law enforcement, DEA, to tap into phones. They weren't secret about selling fentanyl or wanting to sell fentanyl or getting into that market. But the part of the wiretap and the part of them bragging, boasting, relishing in this idea of creating streets of American junkies. And this is something that that baffles my mind, because they're aware of the potency, the lethality, the addictive qualities of this stuff. They're aware of what happened with Purdue Pharma and the opioid crisis. And they're very deliberate about this. They're knowing the potential.
Absolutely. Their business is selling drugs and making people addicted. So I'm not surprised that deliberate. I'm not even surprised that they say we want to create streets of American junkie. That's what you do if you're a pusher or a trafficker. What I think is astounding is their calculation that it doesn't really matter how many people they will kill, because they will end up with so many more people addicted. It is the utter absolute cynicism and indifference to death toward of users, and also indifferent to deaths from murders and torture in Mexico. Now, we have the indictments of the Chapitos also show, for example, that the Chapitos experiment on their victims, on their slaves, on their rivals with dosages of fentanyl. They cook a new batch and they shoot people to see whether they die or live. Now, where it becomes really morally gruesome is that even when the people die, they still send it on to the U.S. But all that said, all this horrific cynicism, immorality, just utter indifference to death, they are still nicer than Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, which is what makes the arrest, and especially particularly the arrest of not one of the Chapitos, of their godfather, surrogate father, and ultimately rival, El Mayo, very complicated at the strategic level.
And yeah, I think this is a point. I mean, the word fentanyl, we've talked about this before, kind of the retail word is very popular out there. This issue of, I don't want to say criminality, but I guess indifference is, to me, a mild word. It seems more perhaps like just wanton aggression. Some people like to use being poisoned or weapon of mass destruction. But just to be clear again,
I don't really think that's what's going on. So, the Chapitos don't want to destroy the United States. The United States is a primary market for them. They want to be sending fentanyl to the US in the same way they're sending coke and heroin and methamphetamine, which is another important business. And incidentally, the Mexican cartels, including Sinaloa, are now cooking such super potent meth that many people are also dying from meth. That's unprecedented, meth uncut with fentanyl. So, methamphetamine historically has had horrific morbidity effects. It's a really, really bad substance use disorder with significant physical effects. But it wasn't that deadly. But now this Mexican super meth being cooked is also very lethal because of the potency of the drug. But it's not warfare. It's not a desire by them or for that matter, by Chinese criminal networks that are selling them the precursors to destroy the United States, in my view. And certainly not for the Chapitos. They are not revolutionaries. They want the criminal market to operate, and for the criminal market, they need society and the legal market to operate. But it is just the indifference in how many people they kill along in the way of sustaining the market. And incidentally, the Chapitos are in many ways very voracious capitalists who also pioneered the takeover of legal economies in Mexico in a major threat and major break with how drug trafficking groups have operated for a long time.
Okay, so to be clear there, rhetoric about they just want to kill Americans, that's clearly
not
a good business model.
That's not their objective. That's not what they say. I mean, if you kind of read through the indictments, it's not that they say we want to kill Americans. No, they say we want to kill junkies who will be buying other products. We want to create streets of junkies. So many of them are buying our products. And we will diversify in all these other illegal and legal economies so that, our income portfolio grows enormously. But if along the way people are killed because we murder them or because they OD, tough luck.
And I've seen some rationalization with, well, it's not our fault that they chose to hear all these interesting bending themselves into pretzels to justify the fact that they're supplying these drugs. How will this affect their rival? How will these arrests yesterday affect, in your view? This is Walmart and Target, if you will, metaphorically speaking.
I'm sure the two companies would not appreciate that comparison, but they are the two very large operations, major criminal groups that are tribal in Mexico. And it's even more complicated story, right? Because there is actually a three-way competition happening that will be intensified by the arrests. Both El Mayo, the Ismael Zambada Garcia, the older drug trafficker, and the Chapitos are part of the Sinaloa Cartel, sometimes referred to as the Sinaloa Federation. And they used to be very close. El Mayo was the surrogate godfather to the Chapitos. He helped them to take over succession. When El Chapo was extradited, he saved their lives. When two of the sons were captured by the arch rival, by Jalisco, their fate looked very precarious. They were about to die very nasty death, very likely. And El Mayo, with his negotiator, mediator, acumen, got them out. But in recent years, especially the past 4 years or so, 5 years, the two branches of the same cartel, Sinaloa, fell apart. And the tensions have been mounting, relations soured, because El Mayo was very unhappy and increasingly concerned about the way the Chapitos were just provoking the U.S. and drawing the wrath of the U.S. Onto the cartel on its very basis, the brashness and aggressiveness with which they, and especially one of them, Ovidio, was behaving. And so the rumor goes that the intelligence for the arrest of Ovidio Guzman, one of the Chapitos, that took place in January of 2023, was actually intelligence provided to U.S. law enforcement from the El Mayo group. Now, the arrest of the two men, and especially the arrest of El Mayo, appears to be a betrayal by one of the sons, who lured him onto a plane. The nature of the arrest, the nature of the operation is telenovela worthy. And it appears that in retaliation for the arrest of his brother Ovidio, and perhaps to get some better term for Ovidio, such as not being a supermax, Joaquin betrayed El Mayo, tricked him onto the plane, told him that the plane would go observe the drug airstrips in northern Mexico, and instead it landed in the U.S. And immediately both men were arrested by U.S. law enforcement. So, in the immediate term, the arrest will amplify, exacerbate the warfare between the Zambada branch of the Sinaloa Cartel and the Chapitos. But the arch rival, Jalisco Nueva Generación, is not going to just ignore this opportunity. It already battles both branches, Sinaloa overall, across Mexico. And they will now feel this tremendous opportunity to jump into the fray and to try to take the turf, corruption networks, local proxies, local criminal vassals, corrupt government officials from Sinaloa. And so there's a very, very high potential that the arrest will conflate violence in Mexico all the way from the northern border with the US down south to Chiapas. And in my view, will have potentially, not immediate, but in a matter of time, repercussions, certainly across the America, but we could potentially see them all the way as far back or as far away as Australia, the Asia Pacific region.
Wow. And you were saying earlier, we tend to think of El Chapo as the godfather, but it sounds like this arrest was as significant, would you say?
I would say so. In many ways, I would say that it's perhaps even more significant, and not necessarily for the better. So El Mayo was, I mentioned already, the consigliere among the capos. He was the one who had other tools in his toolbox than simply violence. He is very responsible for murders and aggression. He was involved in all the torture. He used to be an enforcer for a previous godfather of the Guadalajara cartel. So, he's not a nice gentleman. But he was also really adroit in negotiating deals, tempering down violence, mediating among the criminal groups. And he was the corruptor-in-chief among certainly the Sinaloa, but also more broadly among the cartels. His really superpower, evil superpower as a criminal, was to be generating these corruption networks across many years, over many generations of Mexican officials and many administrations. And so, the one big positive thing is not that flows of fentanyl will be reduced, but it's potentially that he will provide evidence on both former and current Mexican officials, law enforcement officials, and their involvement in drug trafficking. And if he does provide that evidence, such as to get treatment for the illnesses that plague him, diabetes and kidneys issues and others, then the United States will hopefully be able to make indictments against other, hopefully many, corrupt Mexican government officials, and perhaps prosecute some and convict some in the way it did with Genaro Garcia Luna, who was essentially the Minister of Security in Mexico during the Calderon administration. But the downsides are the violence that this will trigger, increase in an already enormously violent market in Mexico. And his capture, his removal is sort of taking the last seasoned guy who could think of other things than simply get in a fighting war, the one who could mediate, the cool-headed negotiator and mediator out of the system.
We're United Against Fentanyl is a nonpartisan organization. Brookings is a nonpartisan organization, but there is sometimes quite a bit of banter you hear out in social media about one administration being better. This happened under the Biden administration. Merrick Garland came out and yesterday very explicitly talked about how this administration is committed to this work. I guess the question is, with so much intelligence that we seem to have, and I know you're not going to have an easy answer, but no one knows this stuff more than you do. Why is it so difficult to bring these guys down, to find them? Or what happened yesterday?
Well, obviously these are top criminal groups in the world, and they are the bosses of top criminal
in the world.
Certainly, might not be the most powerful in the world, but it's, there will be few Chinese triads that I would say are as powerful as the Sinaloa Cartel. Maybe 14K. Bamboo United is probably not as powerful and not as widely present as Sinaloa. So, it is in the very, very top echelon. Now, daily face threats from rivals. You face threats from within your organizations. You cannot trust people that they will not betray you, like Joaquin appeared to do with El Mayo. And you face threats from law enforcement. Sometimes local law enforcement, but many international law enforcement agencies would want to get their hands on you. They should run highly carefully structured operational security. Their survival is their business. So it's very difficult to infiltrate these networks, and they routinely use horrific, gruesome torture, all kinds of methods that would not be imaginable in a rule of law abiding society for law enforcement that needs to abide by rule of law in how they vet people, in how they commit people to their causes. So infiltration is very hard. But within this enormous complexity of running an operation like the Homeland Security investigation did with Federal Bureau of Investigation in capturing El Mayo, in seducing Joaquin to betray El Mayo, or how the Drug Enforcement Administration did with very many other arrests, including of El Chapo. Bringing the campus down is not that difficult. I mean, obviously it's very difficult, but within the levels of difficulty, the tougher thing to do, but in many ways the far more important thing to do, is to go after the middle operational layer of the groups and to try to bring that middle operational layer down in one move as much as possible. Why is it so much more important? It's because if you eliminate the operational group, you disable the network functionality. That doesn't mean that's the end of crime. It doesn't mean that it's the takeover of that particular market, criminal market, by other criminal organization, but the levels of violence are substantially lowered. If you just take down the boss, like in this case, Zambada, someone from Zambada from his group will take over the leadership. He has been, so it's rumored, negotiating with U.S. law enforcement several years about a potential surrender. He was a very shrewd guy. Very likely he put succession systems in place for when he died, when he's arrested, when he handed himself over. So his arrest is very important. It will have critical repercussions across global markets and Mexico's criminal markets. He has a lot of dough on corrupt officials, but someone else from his group will take the leadership. If you eliminate them, the same with the Chapitos and Joaquin, plus you still have two of the sons at large, and they will be running the Sinaloa Cartel. But if you take the middle layer down, as much of the middle layer at once, then this region, immediate creation, immediate reproduction of new leaders cannot take place. But running middle layer targeting operations, especially large-scale ones that bring down a lot of the layer down at once, is very difficult. It requires sitting on intelligence for a long time. It requires presence on the ground, and it requires patience. Now, this is very hard to do in a country like Mexico, where U.S. law enforcement has been critically hampered in its on-the-ground presence by various Mexican administrations, including immensely so by the current administration of Andrés Manuel Lopez Obrador. Sitting on intelligence for a long time is tricky, since you know that your Mexican counterparts are a very legal ship, deeply infiltrated. Incidentally, the US government did not tell the government of Mexico they were going to do the snatch. And I'm not at all surprised because there would be enormous risks that intelligence would leak to El Mayo. He is so knowledgeable where all the government corpses are that if very many people got wind of the fact the US was going to get him, they would be warning him because they wouldn't want him to provide intelligence. And it's not at all surprising. So, it's very hard to run these extraordinarily impressive undercover high-value targeting ops. But it's more potent, much more of a blow, but much more difficult to run middle-layer targeting.
I'm still struck with, I knew as much, but it really hit me when you said that these two cartels are amongst the largest criminal networks in the world. I mean, we're in the United States, and so I think it might be easy for some people to think, well, we just hear about them because they're just across the border. But these are global organizations of the highest order.
Totally. Other than few Chinese triads, there is no one else with their capacity, geographic spread. Now, there is a big difference in how the Asian criminal groups like 14K behave. They are much less violent. In Mexico, 30,000 people die every year as a result of criminal violence. The law enforcement response is often very violent and kills people. And many more people are likely dead because in recent years, the cartels have moved toward disappearing people. Now, what that means is that people are kidnapped and killed, just the bodies are never found. Right. So the death rate is probably much, much higher, at least 100,000, 100,000, perhaps more people have disappeared in Mexico that have not been found. The rates of death and destruction are enormous. With the 14K kills few tens of people a year. That's still egregious, but we're talking about single-digit murder rates per 100,000. Not just in their operations in China, but in their operations across Southeast Asia, right. Let alone their operations out of theater in places like Africa or Latin America. If violence among Asian criminal groups escalates to hundreds in a year, that's a really violent year. Whereas in Mexico, we're talking about tens of thousands per year.
This is off topic a bit, but have there been studies? Have you studied this as to why? What's in the DNA of? So I'm half Mexican, but I'm a pretty
Rosetta Stone of criminology and crime studies, and you hear people putting forward many explanations that range from cultural explanation to the brutality of colonialism in Latin America, the destruction of the Latin indigenous kingdoms like the Incas and the Mayas and the Aztecs, as an explanation for the acculturations to violence. My own explanation is quite different. And that is that in Asia, law enforcement has been not accountable to the people, has been tightly controlled by the state and serves the interests of the state, but has been very potent and been able to create deterrence effects against criminal groups and across criminal markets. Whereas in Latin America, for decades now, really a century, law enforcement has lost the deterrence capacity. It no longer intimidates criminal groups. It doesn't structure how they behave. And the reason why I think this explanation is particularly potent is because you can look at the behavior of the Mexican cartels in Mexico and in the US. So in Mexico, very violent, 30,000 people dead a year for the past almost 20 years, or more like 15, but very significant death rates over the past 20 years. Very many more people disappeared, huge levels of brutality, torture, kidnapping. Whereas in the US, the two Mexican cartels are present across the country. They are the principal wholesale distributors of drugs. They don't distribute at the retail level. They hand it over to local groups, but they deliver up to the middle level. And yet they behave very, very peacefully. They are not behind tremendous amount of violence in the US. There is a lot of violence in the local retail markets. There is other gang violence, but it's not the violence of the two cartels. And you have even more specific examples, for example, that have showed up in recent indictments and court documents, where you would have operators from the Sinaloa Cartel being very frustrated with one of their underlings who fails to bring the money for an amount of drugs, I believe fentanyl, I'm not sure 100% whether it was fentanyl, that he was supposed to sell and distribute. And so one of the plaza bosses, one of the local captains, says, well, we should go kill him because he failed to do what he was ordered to do and he failed to pay us. And the higher level boss says, oh no, this is not Mexico. You cannot go kill him. We'll beat him up, but we cannot kill him because that would really draw the attention of US law enforcement to us. You cannot behave the same way you used to behaving in Mexico. This is just one anecdote that, however, in my view, quite potently captures the deterrence capacities that law enforcement in Asia, in the United States, in Canada, in Western Europe has, that it doesn't have in places like Mexico and much of Latin America.
So thank you for that. When you say that there's violence, wanton, indiscriminate violence south of the border, but north of the border, the cartels are the wholesalers. I'm assuming many of them are U.S. citizens then.
Certainly, many of the operatives that work for the two cartels are U.S. citizens. Sometimes they are dual citizens, but the cartels obviously understand that it's highly advantageous to recruit U.S. Citizens for their operations. Then they are less likely to be stopped by law enforcement. They are less likely to have their car checked. When they're bringing fentanyl, it's far easier for them to buy weapons that they will smuggle to Mexico. Obviously, they do recruit U.S. citizens. I would also just, kind of correct the notion that the violence in Mexico is wanton. That's a component of it. And several years ago, I wrote a long report that was called The Out of Control Crime Market in Mexico, or Mexico's Out of Control Crime Market, where there is a lot of violence that is sort of generated in of itself, from which the criminal market and criminal groups cannot break out. And a lot of that violence has been driven precisely by policies, by high-value targeting, such as the arrest of Joaquin and El Mayo. It's been a huge driver of the violence. There is also a real kind of indulgence and acculturation to torture, mayhem, brutality, gruesome social media posts of murders and torture that the cartels do, and especially Jalisco is like far more brutal and far more brazen than Sinaloa. The Sinaloa is very brutal, but calibrates its brutality with political capital and with restraint. And this is especially true about El Mayo and El Chapo. Whereas Jalisco's entire MO is just brutality, ibrales, be more brutal than anyone else. That's how you intimidate actors. So if you think of the Machiavellian choice that Machiavelli tells the prince, you can be feared and loved, but if you can only be one, be feared. That's the Jalisco approach to governing, to criminal governance, whereas Sinaloa wants to be both feared and loved, and so has been much more political with engaging in social distribution, building political capital among local people across the country. But there is a lot of premediation, purposefulness, choices to the violence. It's not just kind of complete out of control Hobbesian world, where that image is closer but still incomplete to what's happening with gangs in Haiti.
Wow. With the upcoming new administration, I'm guessing we should be more hopeful than the current administration. But with this relation,
I'm assuming that you're speaking about the upcoming administration of Claudia Sheinbaum in Mexico.
Of Sheinbaum, yeah. I'm sorry. I'm assuming we're more hopeful here.
Well, I think that's an open question. Certainly, Ms. Sheinbaum, President-elect Sheinbaum, claims that it was her policies that reduced violence in Mexico City, in the capital. Violence does appear to go down, or does appear to have gone down. We know it did. The question is what caused it and to what extent this was driven by criminal market dynamics in of themselves, and to what extent it was driven by policies. She did mount some good policies that at the local level in Mexico City that she wants to replicate at the national level, such as having more investigators and having more prosecutions and investigations. That's crucial. Her former boss and the man who who was her political teacher, Lopez Obrador, destroyed the investigative capacity of Mexico, eliminated the federal police, which was corrupt and infiltrated by the Sinaloa Cartel, but also had capacities and had investigative capacities and almost the sole investigative responsibility. And he very much politicized the prosecutor's office, which is the National Prosecutor's Office, which is the other body that has investigative capacity and an investigative mandate vis-a-vis the cartels. So her talk about having more investigators backs what her teacher was doing, and it's a good move. But if she is serious about taking on the cartels, she will run into a lot of opposition. And her phrasing so far has been, I'll do everything that Lopez Obrador has done with respect to the cartels, and I'll add some things to it, like, having investigators. Well, one of the core things that Lopez Obrador did was to essentially direct security forces and law enforcement forces in Mexico not to confront the cartels. He essentially gave the cartels a carte blanche, especially when it came to any use of law enforcement. So, he had a kind of long-term strategy in which he hoped that giving economic opportunities to young, disprivileged people, some technical training, some social handouts would divert them from the path of crime. That's important. In a lot of my work over many years, over 2 decades, I have argued for the need to couple law enforcement with socioeconomic approaches. The problem is that you need to couple law enforcement with socioeconomic approaches, whereas he just completely gave up on law enforcement. And a lot of the design of the socioeconomic programs is highly questionable, very inchoate. I am quite skeptical that this is generating any payoffs in terms of diverting people from the path of crime. But so she says she will do the same. Okay, I hope she will really improve the programs if she will continue giving them money. But what will be really bad is if there is still these instructions, law enforcement don't stand up against the cartels. And so hopefully her talk about more investigators will be coupled with a more wherewithal to use law enforcement. But it's a very tough proposition. The narcos are eating Mexico alive. The state is much weakened. They control political institutions at all layers of the government. They control legal economies. They are very violent. Taking them on is a very difficult proposition.
As you know, our charter is to look at a comprehensive approach to solving this fentanyl crisis, which includes China, the cartels, the smugglers, the dealers, and the users. I have to be honest, and we've spoken before, but not in this much detail. What has stuck out to me today is just that ecosystem in Mexico versus the ecosystem in China, where the Chinese government, if they say don't do something, you probably shouldn't. And they have that capacity to put down the hammer. And I'm not that encouraged in this conversation, and I don't think I was before the conversation, but one of the questions we have on the screen is, what does this mean for the supply of fentanyl to the U.S.? We have an upcoming new president. We have 2 major kingpins that are now out of business, if you will. Where do you see this going?
So, I'll answer, but let me just reflect on your hammer question. So the Chinese government absolutely has a hammer, and the criminal groups and criminal networks are very afraid of that hammer. And they also court the Chinese government not to use that hammer. In Mexico, there is a hammer, but it's much thinner, much weaker hammer. And it's not very much feared by the criminal groups. And they are well used to diverting the hammer from them onto their rivals or completely away by bribing law enforcement actors in Mexico, or for that matter, threatening them. I mean, there is also just tremendous killing, intimidation of honest police officers who are dedicating, and law enforcement officials who are dedicating their lives to fighting for rule of law in Mexico. They're risking their lives on a daily basis and the lives of their families, and not just being killed by a bullet, but potentially subjecting their children, their spouses to be killed through horrendous torture. So being a committed, honest Mexican official, and there are such people, committed and honest Mexican investigators, is an enormously gutsy, daring proposition with not just the bribery, but the violence they face. Now, what this means for fentanyl flows to the US, I think very little. First of all, there is still the Sinaloa Cartel. You have two of the Chapitos still at large. Someone from the Zambada branch will likely step very quickly to be running that branch. And even if through the internecine violence between the two groups and with Jalisco, Sinaloa was to implode, which I don't think is likely, but even if that were to happen, you have the Jalisco cartel already well plugged into fentanyl trafficking on par with Sinaloa. And, you can imagine all kinds of other groups in Mexico. So, getting El Mayo and Joaquin is complication for them at best, certainly complication in the way it will trigger violence in Mexico within the two groups and with Jalisco. But it's very unlikely to have any effects on fentanyl flows. A lot of the fentanyl trafficking is not commanded by a cell phone by either of the Chapitos. They are very important actors. They set parameters. Jesus, one of the sons who is at large, is the man who was expanding and running international operations. Ovidio was very focused on fentanyl productions and operations in Mexico. So, they will need to adjust, but they have plenty of ways of adjusting, which goes back to what I was saying. If you can bring down the middle layer all at once, ideally as much as once, then you have a much better capacity to prevent the operational systems of the group than if you simply just get one of them, however glamorous and prestigious target it might seem to be.
Refresh my memory on the middle. What were you referring to there? The middle layer?
So this would be the financial money launderers. This would be the people who are setting up logistical networks. These would be the ones who are figuring out how you move fentanyl that's cooked in a lab in Culiacan or in the mountains of Sinaloa and move it across Mexico and across the border to Chicago. These would be the security branch of the cartels, who are focused on operational security, who are focused on combating the rivals, not the street fighter, but the military commanders, commanders and deputies, if you'd like. That's the operational layer, the management layer that sits under the CEO, if you would like.
Right. I was speaking with a former DEA, senior DEA person, and again, this is obvious, but I don't think it's obvious to the millions and millions of Americans who are aware of fentanyl, who are afraid of fentanyl, who are aware of what's going on. And he just said the issue is corruption. It's not even drugs, it's corruption. And I know that this is what you do for a living, but I don't think that that reality filters into the population either. We tend to think of, well, these people shouldn't use the drugs, or, we're dealing with, like you said earlier, the largest criminal organizations that are just on the other side of the border. I'm in Southern California, so in my case, I could be at the Mexican border in an hour and a half. It's very daunting to think about.
Absolutely. I mean, the potency and power of the cartels in Mexico, their proclivity to violence, and the way in which they have been able to take over economies, legal economies, territories, institutions, and people in Mexico is a function of the weakness of the state. It's both weakness of capacity, compounded by the Lopez Obrador administration by destroying institutional budgets and checks and balances, but it's also very much a weakness of will. And that weakness of will, that unwillingness to confront the cartels, comes from fear and comes from corruption.
If we're going to wrap up here soon, Vanda, and as always, I'm really grateful. If you had a wish list of U.S. government actions going forward to curb fentanyl trafficking, what, prioritizing? It's paradoxical because you just said we've gotten these two major influential men. They're behind bars and they're not on their cell phones or anywhere else barking orders. But I'm confounded with the complexity of this. I mean, here we have 80,000 at least people in this country dying. There's talk about weaponizing and aerosolizing fentanyl, and we know that's happened before, at least in Russia. But really, we just have a really complex. I'm not asking a question right now. I think I'm just.
I mean, the weaponization of fentanyl is really a completely separate issue. That's not what the cartels want to do. The cartels are not agents of the government of Russia to be killing U.S. citizens wholesale. They want to get U.S. citizens addicted, so they keep buying their product. And the easiest way to get them addicted is fentanyl. Ultimately, the most important element of the response is providing better access to treatment of people who have developed substance use disorder, opioid use disorder, enabling them to use in a way that doesn't result in lethal overdose, and more importantly, putting them in treatment that will decrease their use. Some people will be able to stop using, many will not be able to stop using. They will spend their lives on something like methadone, but that buprenorphine, but that's far better than simply having people die. So focusing on treatment in the United States, focusing on harm reduction is critical. That is the dream list. That needs to be the core element of the policy. And it's been that case for the Biden administration. But we have a very long way to go. On specifically what to do against trafficking, well, I would say that my dream list would be to move away from high-value targeting. And to the extent that we engage in any targeting, high-value or middle layer, to be far more strategic about it. Instead of focusing on the opportunistic tactical hit, as glamorous, dramatic, amazing undercover op as was the arrest of El Mayo, to be thinking what criminal market in Mexico is least harmful to us? What kind of criminal groups, what kind of criminal bosses will have least proclivity toward violence, will operate with restraints? If they are sending fentanyl, they're not going to send faulty superpotent batches. What kind of criminal groups in Mexico will have less capacity to corrupt? This is how I wish we would be able to do targeting with fentanyl specifically, but beyond fentanyl. And this applies to our counterterrorism operations in Somalia, to the way we did counterinsurgency operation in Afghanistan. Move away from the glamour and the seduction, the siren song of high-value targeting, and focus on the middle layer as much as we can, and focus base targeting on strategic assessments of the most benefit, least harm, as opposed to just the opportunistic nab with the hope that it will bring the group to its knees.
For those listening, there probably aren't any that don't understand the sequence. Mexico gets chemicals from China, and it's with those chemicals that they make this stuff.
Well, I would correct it. Mexican criminal groups get precursors from Chinese criminal groups.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. China.
Not the governments of both countries.
Yes, thank you. And that's such an important clarification, because, again, you do see out in some of the retail activism that it's actually the government, where, of course, it's something more a kind or a species of that. Is the spigot of precursor chemicals from Chinese chemical manufacturers to Mexico stopping anytime soon?
Well, the Biden administration was able to achieve a significant diplomatic breakthrough in the November of last year of bringing China back to restarting cooperation on fentanyl and drugs broadly, but especially fentanyl. And part of that cooperation is China focusing on the flow of precursor chemicals out of China to Mexican groups. So the fact that we have some cooperation and that cooperation has been lasting, there's been a lot of positive reaction from the US government, including Secretary Blinken in June, for example, about the extent of China's cooperation. That's all great. Now, the road to be traveled is very far, and there are major obstacles. China points out that the precursors are legal, and hence it cannot really crack down on them. It cannot monitor them. China says we don't have material support laws. So you Americans can try your chemical companies if they were diverting precursors to the cartels on basis of material support clauses or cooperating with a designated terrorist or criminal group. We don't have that. We cannot try that way. China has not been willing to put in place know your customer laws to reduce the proclivity of the chemical and pharmaceutical factors, especially the smaller firms in those sectors, of which there are many, to be selling precursors for drug, narcotics, trade purposes. But we have cooperation, which we didn't have for a long time. So it was accomplishment. How far that accomplishment will bring us is another question. Some statements from the US government have suggested that there's been a slowing down of the amount of precursors coming out of China. I don't think this has had any effects on production in Mexico. And again, just a very little amount of these chemicals needs to be smuggled. So I wouldn't expect that we will get to a point where there are no more precursors available to criminal groups. But just as we don't want these super potent Mexican organizations to become even more potent and be untouchable by law enforcement, there is very good reason to go after Chinese criminal networks. And if we can secure China's cooperations in doing so, as opposed to allowing the networks to be brazen, indifferent, and grow more powerful, that's very important.
So the short of it then would be not in 2024, not in 2020. The spigot's not going to be shut off. I guess I keep wondering, and I've never asked you this before, could Mexico eventually create their own precursor chemicals?
Yeah, it could. I don't think you say there is no more precursors coming out of China. It's very unlikely that the next jump would be production in Mexico. The immediate replacement country is India. That's a country whom the United States has been desperately trying to put as a strategic partner against China in the Asia-Pacific region. India's pharmaceutical chemical companies is far dirtier, far less regulated, far more problematic than China's. India is the source of tremendous amount of synthetic drugs, illegal synthetic drugs globally, including some for the US market. And you already have established connections between the Mexican cartels and suppliers, illegal criminal suppliers in India. But India has been cooperating over the past several years during the Biden administration with the US in trying to build up better regulatory systems and better law enforcement capacities from very, very low baseline, far lower yet than China's. So India would be the immediate likely replacement if China went offline. But potentially over time, you could see production shifting to various other countries. If a country has large chemical or pharmaceutical production, they are a likely place where criminal groups will shop for precursors. But over time, you could even have production from such very basic chemicals that much greater depth of production could be taking place in Mexico. And that's what's happened with meth already. For a while, the Mexican cartels were making meth out of what we call precursors, some of which have been banned at the international level, and China has scheduled them, and the supply of them went down. And the cartels then, with the help of Chinese cooks, Chinese chemists, moved to making fentanyl from far more basic chemicals that are widely used for legal purposes and hence are not going to be scheduled. It's exactly the same thing that happened with methamphetamine. So you could have wide diversification of the very basic chemicals from which highly potent synthetic drugs, whether synthetic opioids or other synthetic drugs, could be made. So the supply will remain an enormous challenge. We're not going to get to a space where there are no more chemicals from which very dangerous synthetic drugs are going to be made. And that should not be the focus or strategy for the United States or anyone else. Dismantling networks, keeping their power down, structuring their choices through law enforcement to be less bad criminals, to be concerned about death, not to be sending faulty batches, and not to have much capacity to corrupt, is what, not to be violent, not to cause homicides, to behave peacefully, almost peacefully in the US, and to behave in the same way in Mexico, is what law enforcement in the drug game is about.
I am an optimist, and people that know me well know that I'm an optimist. The more I listen and read and spend time with people like you, the more, coupled with what we spoke about last time, which is a real seismic shift from crop-based to synthetic-based drugs. This is going to be around for a while, to say the very least. And I think another component that I'm learning about too is just the simplicity to actually make the fentanyl. There was, you read the Reuters article yesterday probably, and somebody ordered for $3,600.
The Reuters investigative team, very powerful report. I highly recommend people reading it, and not surprising findings, but just really highlights the complexity of the law enforcement challenge and supply challenge.
And I'm much newer to this space than you are, but that article, it's just sobering that somebody went online, put in their information, got a box that's half the size of a shoebox, and for $3,000, $3,500, they could make a few million fentanyl pills. And everything that you've said today substantiates the reality of this problem and how there just are no, in a world, and I was just in Washington, D.C., in a universe here in the U.S. where there are a lot of silver bullets being offered as to how to solve this problem, it's crystal clear to me that even this major bust yesterday is not by any means the end. And you even said it could even create more supply. Who knows?
I don't think it will create more supply, but I think it will create a lot more violence in Mexico. And that's bad for Mexico, Mexican people, and it's bad for the United States as well. It just fosters an environment where the narcos are taking over the country in very multifaceted way. Look, there are no silver bullets. If there were, we would have used them already. Law enforcement is an enormous complex undertaking, and dealing with drug enforcement is enormously complex undertaking. And the policy debate, discussion shouldn't oscillate between what is the one fix that will end fentanyl supply to let's just give up on law enforcement, which is essentially what the government of Lopez Obrador did. Law enforcement is very, very important, not because it will hold supply, but because it can structure the behavior of criminal markets and drive markets toward less bad criminal markets with much less violence and ideally very little violence, shape criminal groups so they don't have much capacity to corrupt, and so they don't have much capacity to expand to other ventures like legal economies. And so they don't rise to the level of threat that we see in Mexico. And giving up on that law enforcement would be a critical mistake. So we need to think very hard and very strategically about what we want law enforcement to accomplish. We should not be seduced by high-value targeting. We shouldn't be seduced by the notion of silver bullets. But just to say, let's just decriminalize and have no law enforcement would be very faulty. Decriminalizing, punishing users, absolutely. We don't want to be sending users to prison for nonviolent use. We want to be putting users for treatment, providing them assistance with a very difficult chronic illness. But we need law enforcement to shape the markets toward less violence, less harm, less potent drug, less capacity to corrupt, and less capacity to spread into other domains of societies and economies.
Yeah, and it's interesting with our organization to say 100% for enforcement and 100% for education, harm reduction. I've been shot at both from both ends. From some people saying, "What do you mean enforcement? You mean war on drugs?" Or, no, but when I go to airports, I like the idea of TSA. I kind of like the idea of people there that are going to keep us safe and enforce violations.
Right. In my view, the question is not law enforcement, yes or no. We absolutely need law enforcement. But how to have law enforcement that's effective, that's accountable. And, I am also very grateful when I have diligent TSA officers making sure I'm safe at airports and on planes. And I'm especially grateful when they are not abusive and treat with passengers as their customers. And as their bosses, as being accountable to them. So no one wants law enforcement that's ineffective and that's brutal, let alone corrupt, which I don't think is the case with TSA, but it's certainly the case with a lot of law enforcement in Mexico. So we want law enforcement that's effective, that's accountable, and that minimizes its own use of violence, in addition to minimizing violence by the criminal groups.
One of the things I did this year, I went to Mexico City and was able to get in a car where there was a big police convoy. I don't remember. It was the Mexico City police and another organization, and it was in eastern Mexico City, and driving neighborhoods and just being there. And man, it really dawned on me how many of these law enforcement officials they do in the U.S. too, but they're putting their lives so much on the line.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, you could feel it.
Killing a cop, killing a military, a lot of the officers deployed on the street of Mexico for policing work are Mexican military officials or members of the National Guard. They are putting their lives in a way that, fortunately, law enforcement in the United States doesn't have to face. If you kill a cop in the US, all of your law enforcement comes down on you, both to arrest that individual and remove that individual, but also to send deterrence. You just don't do this. Whereas in Mexico, cops are killed all the time. And it is the enormous death rate and threats they face, their family faces, that makes them all the more susceptible to corruption. If your choice is you will be killed or tortured, or you take the bribe, it takes tremendous wherewithal and strength of character, and also choices about safety of your family to say, no, I won't take the bribe.
Yeah.
So I would end on really embracing law enforcement in both countries, but law enforcement that I will repeat is effective, accountable, and minimizes the violence of criminal groups, but also the violence that it does in itself. And of course, in the United States, we have massive challenges with the killings by US police, especially of people of minorities. So we need to fix that on our side, but where we have been very effective is minimizing the violence of organized crime groups in the United States. And we need to improve our policies also abroad and think hard about targeting strategies like high-value targeting. So applause for getting Joaquin, applause for getting Mayo, and let's think hard about when and how we should do that again.
Well, that's a great ending to an Audible. This is a last-minute thing we decided to do. So as always, I'm really grateful to you, and I hope that you have some rest this weekend with all the buzz going on this very, very big news day in the world of organized crime and especially fentanyl.
Thank you for having me, Paul.
We'll see you soon. Thank you, Vanda.